Hello, everyone. This is Daniel. This is going to be part 17 of my new Christian series, and today we are continuing our little trilogy through testing. It's not really a trilogy because it can be 4 videos, but that is what we are doing. And this is going to be a video that's covering a lot today, so I'm going to jump right in with it all. So, like I've said, we've been covering and talking about different tests that we as Christians go through, what we can do to deal with them, and we've most recently spoken about dealing with condemning thoughts and the unforgivable sin. And the one final difficulty that I want to address in our videos that we address testing with is I want to address the testing that we undergo with our doubts as Christianity. Not every Christian will go through this, but I do believe that it is substantial enough of a test that it needs to be covered. So to start off, it's no secret that we live in an increasingly secular Western culture. But regardless of that, there are other religions out there that claim to give you the spirituality or the truth that people want. Or, there's also the idea that there is no real truth, that there is no God and stuff like that. And with all so many competing views on what the world is really like, how can we know as Christians that the one that we claim to have, or the one that we view, is the one that is actually true, not just another flawed worldview? That is the question we are going to be considering today. But before we do that, I want to talk about how does this fit in with testing. Satan comes into Christians' lives and does everything he can to cast doubt on anything that might be, such as God's love for them or God's commandments against sinning. But one significant truth, but a significant one, is the truth of the Christian worldview. It's been said that one of the greatest tricks that the devil pulled off was convincing the world that he does not exist. And so, for us as Christians, Satan wants to cause anything that can be used. He wants to do anything he can to cause us to doubt. And one of those things will be to even doubt Christianity's truthfulness as a worldview. So Satan is there to fill you as with as much doubt as is possible. And I've personally experienced this as well. Whenever I was living as a sinner, I actually went through an agnosticism sort of phase. It was very brief, but I started to really doubt if God actually exists. And it looked very appealing to me to accept that everything was just a giant cosmic accident. However, I could not actually bring myself to accepting that nothing happened to literally nothing, and it just all poofed into existence. I think there needed to be a cause for that. Secondly, whenever was really starting to seriously dive into apologetics, which is the art of giving an answer for Christianity's truthfulness as a worldview, and also providing defenses against objections. Whenever I started to dive into apologetics back in December 2020, I went through a period where I was watching a lot of atheist versus Christian debates, and I intellectually, looking through the arguments and considering both sides, I still went with the Christian worldview here. And so but I did go through an intense period of doubt here still, but it was not an intellectual doubt that was causing it. It was something that was emotional and spiritual. And I think that this was an emotional and spiritual pressure that Satan had come uh, against me with in order to make me try and abandon it. I was dealing with the thoughts of like, no, the Kalam cosmological argument doesn't actually follow, which we will get into with this video. And I was having thoughts that that doesn't follow, but I think it was perfectly logically sound, and could not, I couldn't mentally assent to the fact that there is no God, or that the arguments for God's existence are bad, because they're actually quite good in my opinion. Um, but I still went through this period of doubt. And so I learned a lesson there, and not with just that, but also with my other lesson that I experienced earlier with doubt when I went through my agnosticism phase. What I want to say is a few things. First, what I learned through that first example that I gave is that I want to warn you that you can come underneath a doubt of God's existence if you continue to willfully sin, even if you originally believed in God's existence. And I think we see this in the Bible, as I'll point out. In Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 24, Paul writes this. He says, For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth and unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. I'll pause there and just mention that that's what I went through. I was living in sin, and God, what he started to do was he started to give me over to the desires of my heart, and my then mind started to be darkened. Even though I did not want to go into a conclusion of God's non-existence, it was actually a very natural process for me. It's not like I was trying to force the process, but this process started to naturally happen. And so that is my warning there, that if a person is continuing in a willful sin and they know of God's existence, I believe that there's going to be an upheaval in their intellectual state about what they think about God's existence. I think it is possible, at least, because I experienced it. Continuing, professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanliness in the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. So that is a result right there: debauchery and more sin. The second lesson that I learned out of these personal experiences with my battles with doubt and the testing of doubt is that if you are a young Christian and you want to study apologetics, if you're looking for genuine answers, go ahead, that's fine. But if you're a young Christian in your faith and you want to get into the art of doing apologetics, what I would suggest to you is make sure that you are very stable in your faith as a committed believer, and take some time to grow. And then it's all right to then, I think, go into apologetics. And the reason I say that is because I don't want anyone to fall into a spiritual war of doubt like I did. Not to say that I was immature as a believer there, but it was a heavy pressure, and and once I beat that heavy pressure, I've never experienced that since that point, even though my study of apologetics has increased. So I know that it was a spiritual test in that sense. There are more details, but I don't have time to go through all of them. So I have learned through my experience that also doubt is not just an intellectual thing, but it can also be something that is very much influenced emotionally and spiritually when that pressure comes against us. And I believe in this situation, what I dealt with was certainly a demonic thing. So the next thing I want to go through with whenever after covering this sort of area of what is the test of doubt here, I want to cover briefly some reasons why do people doubt. This will be very quick. I'm not going to address why; they'll be all addressed later. But here's some reasons why that I point out why people end up doubting or even not believing. The first one is going to be hypocritical Christians. People that are unbelievers, they look at hypocritical Christians who are not living up to what Jesus told us to live up to, and they, in a sense, become disillusioned with Christianity, because Christianity may have been used in a way to hurt them or to abuse someone that they know, or any sort of abuse that they may have gone through under the guise of spirituality and religion. And they experience that and they become disillusioned with it, and then they want nothing to do with it. They look at Christians who are unloving, hateful. They look at religious atrocities, and they don't. They're not really rejecting Christianity on a factual basis, but what they're doing is they're looking at the facts, what happened, and then they're making an emotional rejection of Christianity. This is the only one that I'm going to respond to right now, and my response to such a thing like that is that you cannot really judge a worldview by its misuses. That is something called the genetic fallacy, and the genetic fallacy is you um, whenever you get rid of a belief, or whenever you toss out a belief based on how one person or a group of people came to hold that belief. And so that is the traditional definition of that. But let me explain it with an example. If I use something in the wrong way, it doesn't necessarily mean that that thing that I just used incorrectly doesn't exist or that it's not true. if I use a knife, for example, in the wrong way to maybe stab someone, it doesn't mean that suddenly knives are bad or evil and we have to throw all the knives out in the world. What it means is that I misused the knife. And I want to say that that's the same thing for religion. How people use religion has nothing to say on whether a religion is true or not. What is true in that situation is that the religion may have been misused or abused. And certainly, Jesus would not condone religious atrocities. So we cannot use hypocritical Christians as being a basis for Christianity not being true. The second reason why people end up doubting is something that I call myth theory. I one time ministered to a girl who actually doubted in Jesus because of the Santa stories. So the Santa stories, as you know, they're comparable to Christianity, and because Santa isn't real, and because the similarities between Santa and Christ are there, kids then have a predisposition to associate the false Christmas story of Santa towards Jesus, and they say, well, that's just another false Christmas story, and it's just, fairy tales for grown-ups. So that is a very heavy, that is something that I've noticed that people look at, and that is another thing that causes them to doubt. Along the myth theory line of thinking, people also look at the things in the Bible and wonder if it was meant to be taken literally, or if this is just a moral storytelling sort of thing that's going on in the Bible. If anything less than that, because they may look at other stories in the Bible and they say that's atrocious and stuff like that. So, there's also the doubt between, is the Bible a literal history or is it just moral storytelling? Is it a myth? And also with the myth theory thing, they look at, people also bring up the argument of that, there's myths of other ancient gods and heroes that are similar to Christianity, and they have similar influences and origins, although those are actually incorrect statements right there. But they claim, these are simply claims, they claim that there are rising and dying gods out there, which is, well, look what the Christian story does. They say that religion is also just used to control, exploit, and use people, and religious stories are nothing more than just there to comfort people. So these are some other reasons why people object to Christianity, because they assume without checking the facts that it's a myth off the bat. I say that, with regards to these myth questions, I think these are valid objections and they will be responded to later. Actually, in the next video, not in this one. Another reason why people end up doubting is actually through science. They say, well, they come to this crossroads where they're like, well, hasn't science, scientific discoveries shown us that God doesn't exist? Hasn't science proven that God doesn't exist? Has science shown that God is not necessary? And stuff like that. Another valid objection, we will cover that in the next video. Evolution, this would be a derivative of science, although it is in a way in its own separate category. People have viewed evolution as being the explanation to how we as human beings got here, and because of evolution, we therefore don't need to posit a God anymore here that is responsible for putting us here. That's another thing that causes people to doubt. The next one is, we'll also deal with evolution. We're dealing with all of these here. Evil. The problem of evil, the question is asked, how can a good God exist with all the evil in the world? That will also be talked about. And finally, the problem of hell. People don't like the idea of a God that puts people in hell. Apparently, they think that such an idea of God is too cruel to be true. But you see, here's the thing. Cruelty has nothing to do with the truthfulness of something either. So that will also be addressed. But those are the reasons why people doubt. Now, before we start looking at the evidence, before we start looking at the evidence for anything that I'm going to be talking about here, what we need to do is we must put an emphasis on being truth seekers. Whatever turns out to be true, we cannot emotionally rule out Christianity or anything because of what we have experienced previously, right? With religious abuses or anything like that. What we must do is we need to make sure that we are examining the truthfulness of any worldview. Whenever we do this, whenever we undergo this process, we need to be truth seekers. We need to make sure that we are truth seekers when we are examining the truthfulness of any worldview. If Christianity is not true and Jesus did not rise from the dead, don't be a Christian then. That's actually what the Bible says. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 14 through 19, Paul writes, "And if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty, and your faith is also empty. Yes, and we are found false witnesses of God, because we have testified of God that he raised up Christ, whom he did not raise up, if in fact the dead do not rise. For if the dead do not rise, then Christ is not risen. And if Christ is not risen, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. Then also those who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men the most pitiable. So, right there, Paul says that if Christianity is false, we should be the people who are most pitied by everyone. And so the conclusion stands: we need to seek what is true, whatever is true. If Christianity is true, fine. If it's not true, fine. Right? We need to love what is true, even if it is not a comfortable thing as well. Like I've been reaffirming before, we need to make sure that we do not have emotional presuppositions behind looking at truth claims about Christianity. Most people, unfortunately, end up rejecting Christianity, not necessarily on a rational basis because of examining the evidence, but most of them reject it because of emotional obstacles. People don't like Christianity, and for some of them, for some people, for I think a lot of people, they will take anything that they see as evidence against a Christian position, and they will use that, but it will just be nothing more than an excuse. And this is why I ask: if Christianity is true, would you become a Christian? Ask yourself that. If it's true, would you become a Christian? If not, and you would not become a Christian, then it's obvious that you are not really seeking truth. What you are seeking are things that are going to make you comfortable and that sound comfortable with you. And so, on that note, I just want to make sure that we need to be truth seekers, whatever is true. Whether Christianity is or isn't, we need to seek what is true. But I have good reason to believe, based on evidence and personal experiences, that Christianity indeed is true. Objectively true. Not just true for me and false for you, but true for everyone, everywhere, all the time. Right. So now I can really start to get into the case for Christianity, but I want to first describe the purpose of this video just so we're very clear here. What we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be examining some basic arguments for the truth of Christianity and why we can be confident that it is right. I want you to know that these arguments are not to start your faith if you're already a Christian. That faith starts in the heart and in the Holy Spirit's work within the person. What these arguments I'm going to be presenting, what they're going to do is I want them to make you feel confident and rooted in what you already believe, and hopefully answer also some intellectual questions that you may have had about Christianity. This is where the answers come in that will support the Christian worldview that I talked about in the beginning of the video. Like I said, I'll be providing now arguments for Christianity here. In the next video, I will be discussing responses like Jesus is a myth, questions about science and evolution, the problem of evil, and the problem of hell. And another thing I want to say about this is that the intention of these arguments given here are to provide basic understanding as to why we can have a good reason to trust Christianity. However, these arguments are not meant to be exhaustive, and I agree that these arguments in some ways can be oversimplified because of the time that I have to say it all. However, in addition, this video is primarily, I think, dedicated to Christians who are trying to understand the Christian viewpoint on reasons why we have to believe. If I was responding to atheists, I would take, I think, a similar but also a different approach here. I would want to be more, I would like to be more thorough with the arguments that I would be providing, but I can do it. But just for sake of time, I am providing some very basic things, since people have written books literally on one argument alone here. So obviously I can't cover every single little thing. So there are a lot of things to uncover here, so that's why I will have to be brief with these arguments, and they may seem oversimplified. And so if you have any questions, please contact me. That will be in the description, the email there. And so you can get in touch with me. We can discuss. But anyway, let's get started. The arguments for the existence of God and the truth of Christianity. The first one we need to obviously start off with is, does God exist? If God doesn't exist, well, Christianity is already toast, and so are all the other religions as well. So, how do we know God exists? There are multiple arguments for the existence of God, such as the Kalam Cosmological argument, the argument from intelligent design, which is also known as the teleological argument, and also the moral argument, as well as a vast array of other different ones that philosophers and Christian scientists have come up with. However, for a time, we will be only covering the Kalam cosmological argument today. This is an argument for the existence of God. This argument is very simple. It has two premises that end with a conclusion, and if those two premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. It is exactly what necessarily follows. So with the Kalam cosmological argument, what it posits are two premises. The first one is everything that begins to exist has a cause. And secondly, the universe began to exist. Thirdly, the universe had a cause. Now, whenever we examine these arguments, we need to make sure that the premises are true. So let's examine the first one, right, to see if our conclusion here is true, that the universe indeed has a cause. Well, let's start with the first one. Does everything that begin to exist have a cause? I think this is self-evident. If things don't have causes and the universe just popped into thin air, then why don't other things just pop into thin air? Why don't pizzas and hippos and Titanics just pop out of thin air if there is no cause to bring them to that point? And I just also want to ask a rhetorical question here. What is more reasonable, that something or someone caused the universe to come to existence, or that absolutely nothing caused the universe to exist? I think it's more of a miracle to think that nothing caused everything to come into existence, not that God exists and he caused it to come into being. So this is a very self-evident premise here. In fact, science, if you try and deny this premise, what you are denying science, because science is actually a search for causes. We try and see why things happen, both with experiments in the lab and also through forensic science. So empirical science and forensic science. So if you say that this is not true, well, you're undermining science itself, because science is a search for causes. And so this is something known as the law of causality. This is something that is self-evident as a premise. So the major one here is, well, did the universe begin to exist? And the answer is yes, it did. There is a lot of evidence for this. Scientists have looked at the Big Bang as evidence that the universe began to exist out of nothing, and there is evidence for the Big Bang. I cannot cover them all. There is the second law of thermodynamics, there's general theory of relativity, there's the radiation afterglow from the Big Bang. There's a lot of different things that I can cover here, but again, for sake of time, I'll be only covering one. As I said, this is a basic rundown of arguments for Christianity. We'll be looking at the second law of thermodynamics and why it shows that the universe had to have a beginning and could not be eternal in the past. What the second law of thermodynamics essentially says is that, and shows, is that energy and heat spreads out throughout the universe, and that the universe will actually one day run out of heat and usable energy. That's the key word there, usable energy. Not energy in general, but usable energy. And once all that usable energy in the universe is spread out over the ever-expanding universe, we will enter into something that is known as the heat death. And so what this shows us here is that if the energy is winding down, right? Think of gas in a car. If the gas meter is going down, or think of a battery, right? If a battery keeps on going down and down and down, well, something had to charge that battery up in the first place. A very good example that I have of this is that if you see a campfire burning and you see that the flame increasingly gets smaller and smaller and smaller, you know that someone had to start that fire in the first place. Because if the fire existed forever and this flame is getting smaller and smaller, then technically the fire should have already burnt out if it's past eternal. But it hasn't. It's still burning, and that's the major question that cannot be answered. If the universe is eternal in the past, why are the stars still burning? Why haven't we entered into this heat death of the universe yet? And so what this shows us is that the universe is not infinite in the past, but had to have had a beginning. Something had to have created energy out of nothing. Energy could not have just popped into existence, usable energy, that is. And even energy, because all things that come into existence need a cause right there. So, what are the implications of this argument? Well, Daniel, great job. So what? The universe had a cause. How does this prove God exists? Well, if you think about it, the implications is what proves that there is a very interesting cause behind this. The universe is made up of time, space, and matter. Those are the three big things that we deal with in this universe, and that means that whatever caused the universe and caused space, time, and matter cannot be made of space, time, and matter because things cannot cause themselves. That means that whatever started the universe is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful in order to create the universe, intelligent to make the universe as it is, to make us as intelligent beings. And also, this is something that we get out of the teleological argument, the argument from intelligent design. We understand that this is an intelligent, a super intelligence that has done this. And what we get from here are some very interesting attributes, right? Timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and powerful. What are we left with here? What could be the cause of that? Well, it's what we're left with are now abstract concepts and objects. Either a mind did it or numbers, because those are the two abstract things that exist according to a Christian philosopher, William Lane Craig. And he posits in his argument of for the Kalam that numbers as an abstract object cannot actually cause anything to come into existence. For example, the number 7 or the number 3 cannot actually have causes in the real world. And so what we are left with is a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful, intelligent mind that is responsible for the beginning of the universe. And all of these different attributes sound a lot like God. With regards to spacelessness, God is everywhere. In Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 24, it says, "Can anyone hide himself in secret places? So I shall not see him, says the Lord. Do I not fill heaven and earth, says the Lord." We also see that God is timeless from this, and we see this in the Bible, as in He is eternal. If you don't have a beginning, right, and you are the beginner of everything, then you are eternal. In Psalm 90, verse 2, it says, "Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." Now, of course, a common objection is here, well, if why can't the universe be, if God is eternal, why can't the universe be? The reason is because we have great evidence that the universe had a beginning and is not the first cause. The universe was caused, and that is why you need to have something behind the universe in order to cause everything to come into existence. Finally, God is immaterial, as in being a spirit. In John 4, verse 24, Jesus says God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. So all these different attributes that we get, and look, we didn't look at the Bible to look at the cosmological argument. We looked at just very basic philosophical premises here. And this is the conclusion that we get apart from the Bible. So this is some very great confirmation that God indeed exists, because something had to bring the universe into existence. And we also see from the Bible that it corroborates the things that we can apprehend philosophically just from thinking this way. And here's the thing, right? From this, we know that we have great reason to believe that God exists. There's also other arguments, but this is one very good argument here. And here's the thing: if God exists, then guess what? If God causes the greatest miracle possible, He creates everything out of nothing. Well, then what else? Then He can do smaller miracles that we read in the Bible. Those things are certainly possible if God started the whole show. So we know from this argument that God certainly exists. Now we are going to be looking at arguments for Jesus' resurrection. Because of time, again, we have to go through these quickly. I wish I could give more, but this video could easily go being 2 hours long if I were to cover all the little things here and all the major arguments, even if I don't go in depth. So I have to continue. So arguments for Jesus' resurrection. Obviously, God can exist, but that says nothing about Christianity's truthfulness in that, right? Sure, God may exist, but what if Jesus, didn't actually rise from the dead? Well, as Paul said, your faith is dead. So how do we know if Jesus rose again from the dead? There's a few facts that we need to put in line. First, we have the empty tomb. We have disciples who saw Jesus alive, and we see fulfilled prophecies of these things. And those are the three big things that we're going to be examining. The empty tomb. If the empty tomb was empty and Jesus was no longer in the tomb, and obviously he's gone, right? It may not necessarily mean he's alive, but it certainly means that we do not know if he's dead. Now, the second thing that confirms that he is alive is that the disciples report seeing Jesus alive. If Jesus actually did rise from the dead, the only way we could know, remember, if this is true, the only way we could know if Jesus really rose again from the dead is if someone saw it. If the risen Jesus appeared to you, you would also you would also be unable to deny that. Or you might say, well, it was just some psychological thing, because that's what people like to go to avoid believing in God, and unfortunately. But anyway, so we need to cover these details, right? We see the empty tomb. We see that the disciples saw Jesus alive, and there's evidence that they were not lying about this as well, and that they were sane. And we also see from biblical prophecy that this was already told of beforehand. So let's get started. There's a lot to cover here. This is the biggest section of the video here. Arguments for the empty tomb. We know the tomb was empty because of the specific response of the Jews to Jesus rising from the dead was no more than the disciples stole the body. So I am going to use Bible verses here, but I'm not using the Bible to prove the Bible in that sense. What I am saying here is this, right? I'm going to show from the Bible what the Bible has to say about this, but here's the more important thing. If we know that many nations and governments despised Christianity, especially when it began, especially the Jews. Okay, you could say the regular Jews who did not believe in Christ, in Jesus being the Messiah. The way that they could have stopped Christianity is to find that, his bones, his body, drag him before all of his disciples and say, see, he's dead. He's no longer alive. Stop believing this madness. That is one easy way to disprove Christianity. In fact, it is the biggest and the best way to disprove Christianity if one is able to do it. But here's the problem. No one has been able to find the body of Jesus, even the Pharisees, even the religious leaders of that time who would have loved to find it. So, what do we see about these things? Well, we actually have Matthew reporting what were the Pharisees saying in order to try and make sure that this, resurrection lie, as they saw it, would not happen. In Matthew 27, verses 62 through 64, it says, on the next day, which followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together to Pilate, saying, Sir, we remember while he was still alive, that's Jesus, how the deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise. Therefore command that the tomb be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say to the people, He has risen from the dead. So the last deception will be worse than the first. And this continues, and we see how this plays out in Matthew 28, verses 11 through 15. Now, while they were going, behold, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all the things that had happened. They're talking about the resurrection event. What did the guards tell them? Well, they told them what happened there. And when they had assembled the elders and consulted together, this is the Sanhedrin, the Jewish rulers, they heard what the guards had to say about this. And they're saying, well, what's going on here? What happens? They gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, saying, tell them as a lie, right? This is your excuse. His disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him and make you secure. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. And so what I want to point out here is this. This was an extremely dangerous thing that the elders and the Jews were asking these Roman soldiers to do. And the reason why was because in Roman times, if a Roman soldier was caught asleep while on guard, the punishment was execution on the spot. Well, I don't know if on the spot, but it was going to be execution. And so, and that's why they said, and if this comes to the governor's ears, if the governor finds out, we'll appease him. We'll make sure that he doesn't kill you for sleeping while this happened. So it's very highly unlikely to think that these Roman soldiers would have been asleep during, these events, and that the disciples would have stole the body. Furthermore, this goes into our second point. The disciples actually saw Jesus alive, and they would not make this up. There's some tremendously good examples that I see in the text that actually other apologists have pointed out that shows us that there's no way the disciples were making this stuff up, in the sense that they were not lying about it. First of all, there are embarrassing details in the New Testament text. For example, Peter denies Jesus. In John 13, verses 36 through 38, it says, Simon Peter said to him, Jesus, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered him, where I am going you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow me afterward. Peter said to him, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for your sake. Jesus answered him, will you lay down your life for my sake? Most assuredly, I say to you, the rooster shall not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Here's my question. If the disciples were making this stuff up and they made up the New Testament, would they purposefully embarrass themselves like this, right? Jesus the Messiah. These people, if they're making this up, they put themselves as being the Messiah's, disciples, his closest entourage, and then they say, and guess what? You know what's a good thing to add to the story? Oh, we betrayed him, basically. I said I didn't believe in him. I denied him. No one lies in order to make themselves look bad. People lie to make themselves look good, but people certainly do not lie to make themselves look bad. There are other examples of this. For example, the disciples couldn't cast out a demon. Now, I want you to remember, what if the disciples were writing this trying to make it up? In Matthew 17, verses 14 through 18, it says, and when they had come to the multitude, a man came to him, Jesus, kneeling down to him and saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and suffers severely, for he often falls into the fire and often into the water. So I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him. Then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour. So great. The disciples, if they're making this up, they want to show how incompetent they are in casting out demons, and that Jesus gets frustrated at them not being able to do such a thing. That's also a very interesting detail to put into a text if you're making this stuff up. Thirdly, a disciple runs away naked. In Mark chapter 14, verses 51 through 52, it says, now a certain young man followed Jesus. This is after his arrest, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body, and the young man laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. Why would people make this stuff up? This just makes the disciples look bad, that a disciple ran away naked, being so terrified of the arrest of Jesus. This is just not stuff you would see if a person was trying to make up a legend to make themselves look good. Fourthly, Jesus addresses Peter as Satan, or that Satan is working through Peter. We read in Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 23, from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised the 3rd day. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you. But Jesus turned to him and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan, you are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men. Great. So, when Peter and the apostles were making up their story, they're like, hey, you know what, Peter, let's have Jesus call you Satan. That sounds like a great thing to put in our story. And then Peter goes ahead and he's like, no, have him call you Satan. No, stop doing this to me. So again, I'm playing around with this stuff because these are not things, these are details that you would not see if these were stories that were made up, especially since these people are writing about themselves. They're not writing about some other character, they're writing about themselves. Please remember that Mark, who wrote he wrote his own gospel, he was in cohorts with Peter. And Matthew also was part of that. Luke was a cohort of Paul, and John was an apostle himself, and they have all these embarrassing details in the texts. So I don't see this being made up. So again, the conclusion is, would you make up all these details about yourself if you were going to create a new religion? If you try to create a new religion, would you paint yourself as being someone who betrays, God, someone who God gets frustrated at, and someone who runs away in panic naked because your leader got arrested? Just very simple questions here. The second thing that we see here that this is not being made up is the women's testimony. So not only embarrassing details, but now women's testimony. In Luke 24, for sake of time, I'm not going to read it, but the text is Luke 24, verses 1 through 12. I'm going to have it probably up here on the screen so you can pause it and read it if you would like. But what I want to point out here is that what is significant about women being the first ones to the tomb is that a woman's testimony in ancient times was something that was not seen as valid as a man's testimony. In fact, it was half of a testimony of a man. And here's the thing. If the disciples were making up a new religion, they would want to make it credible by having it be a man who saw the resurrected Jesus. And so this is also showing that these are not things that you would just put in the Bible if you wanted to make a new religion up, because these are examples that actually in a way doubt the Bible, but because these are like bad things in the Bible, in the sense of in terms of trying to make it credible in the contemporary culture, then we know that these are actually truthful events, because if they were not truthful and this was a made up story, you would not want a woman who is maybe uncredible to testify of the event. You would want a man to testify of the resurrection of Jesus. But no, it was women who testified of the resurrection of Jesus. Thirdly, why the disciples are not making this up. Persecution and martyrdom. What do the apostles get out of preaching Jesus? Did they get perks such as money, power, and sex, which is commonly what people do things for, to get money, power, and sex? Did the disciples get a bunch of chicks for preaching Jesus' resurrection? Did they become kings for preaching Jesus' resurrection? Did they become millionaires and billionaires, buying private jets in order to by preaching Jesus' resurrection? No, they did not. What they received was a bunch of things. First of them was persecution. And Paul laments of this in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 9 through 13. He says, "For I think that God has displayed us, the apostles, last, as men condemned to death. For we have been made a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men. We are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ." And here he's speaking to the Corinthian church. "We are weak, but you are strong. You are distinguished, but we are dishonored. To the present hour we both hunger and thirst. We are poorly clothed and beaten and homeless, and we labor working with our own hands. Being reviled we bless, being persecuted we endure, being defamed we entreat. We have been made the filth of the world, the offscouring of all things until now." Well, that, I just want to say that does not sound like a perk of being a Christian here. There's another verse I had prepared, but looking at time, I'm not going to read it, but the reference is 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 through 18, where we also see more things about more things about Paul talking about sufferings. He says that every day our outward man is perishing and stuff like that, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day for our light affliction. He calls it an affliction, but he calls it a light affliction in comparison to the eternal glory that they will see. He says also earlier, he says, "For we who live are always delivered to death for Jesus' sake. And so death is working in us, but life in you." So, the apostles did not get an easy life out of this made up story, if indeed it was a made up story. If it's the truth, then they died. They were being persecuted for the truth. Not only were they being persecuted for the truth, but they also were martyred for the truth. History tells us that at least 11 of the 12 apostles are believed to have been martyred and killed for their faith and did not give up their testimony. And the question here is who would die for a lie that they knowingly made up if they could just be let go and not endure these sufferings, if they would just admit that they lied and just give up the testimony of Jesus' resurrection from the dead? But guess what? They didn't, and they didn't get any perks. They only suffered because of this stuff. This is not stuff that you do in order to. You do not make a religion in order to suffer. I can tell you that. Some more details. You have to consider that the scared apostles were hiding because of the fear of the Jews, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they just had the boldness to proclaim Jesus' death and resurrection in the face of death. What causes such boldness? Sure, a person may not believe that Jesus actually rose again from the dead, but what caused a person to stand in the face of authority and say, "No, this is true"? And not just one person or maybe a few people, but a lot of people, thousands from the very beginning. This is not stuff that just happens naturally. Many times in history, we see that if a person is dead, and this actually transitions into the next point, the spread of Christianity is also evidence. Christianity literally began in the city that Jesus was crucified and died. And it continues to this day. We have seen from history that when political leaders and other leaders, military leaders, whatever they are, when they die, the movement ends most of the time. The movement just ends. But this is a movement that started in the most hostile place possible. Jerusalem, the very place where Jesus was killed. That's where it started. And again, what caused the disciples, even if you don't believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, what caused the disciples to be so bold, especially if everything that they received for preaching this message were only bad things, death, torture, all these different things. They would not be doing this if this was a lie that they made up. What's very interesting about all this is that Christianity was spread peacefully. It was not spread through militantism like as we see with Islam. Islam essentially was military occupation, and then it forced those underneath them to believe in it, and that's how Islam spread. However, Christianity spread completely peacefully without any sort of military movement behind it. Only until 300 years after Christianity's start did it actually get a state to sponsor the religion. So again, if this was a movement that is invalid, how did it even manage to survive for 300 years whenever no state actually sponsored it? So these are things that I don't have enough faith to believe that the resurrection did not happen, because the disciples would not go through the things that they have done if they were making this up. They would not make up the embarrassing details. They would not say that a woman is the one who actually saw the risen Christ first. They would not preach a lie if they were getting just persecuted and killed for it. And Christianity spread even though for 300 years states were hostile against it. You couldn't get rid of it. There was something very strong that kept Christianity alive here. And it was, again, not sponsored by an actual state until 300 years after its inception, which is even more remarkable. So the last things I want to cover are fulfilled prophecy, and then one more thing. But that is the other thing. We see from the past that this was something that was to come in the future. In Isaiah chapter 52, verses 13 through 15, we're going to read Isaiah 52 and all of 53. And we're going to read what it says, and I want you to tell me who this is. It says this: "Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled, and be very high. Just as many were astonished at you, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths at him. For what had not been told them they shall see, and what they had not heard they shall consider." Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 12. "Who has believed their report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form or comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great. He shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And he bore the sins of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. So this is Isaiah. And the big question is, who is this talking about? Well, if you read this to someone who did not know what you were reading from, they would assume, oh, it's talking about Jesus. And then you could ask them, well, where do you think it's coming from, the New Testament or the Old Testament? And they would probably say the New Testament, because that's where Jesus is. But guess what? This doesn't come from the New Testament. This comes from the Old Testament. Furthermore, we have historical evidence that this came before Jesus was even alive. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was a wonderful discovery in corroborating this, since in those scrolls that were discovered somewhere in the 1950s, there was a giant scroll in there. There's also other ones, but there was the it's called the Great Isaiah Scroll, and this scroll was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it contains this very prophecy in there. When scientists dated this scroll, they dated it to being 125 years before Christ, 125 BC. And this is according to the Israel Museum of Jerusalem. So we have some scholarly evidence here that this prophecy here existed before Jesus was even alive. And yes, it was a copy. It was not the original Isaiah scroll, because we don't know that's probably been degraded. This Great Isaiah scroll was copied. I've read somewhere that artificial intelligence actually figured out that it was 2 scribes who worked on it. But nevertheless, this scroll was dated 125 years before Christ was even born. And we see these details, and we look at the life of Christ, and we see these details matching together. And this is another big reason why I personally believe this prophecy talks so very closely about what we know Jesus did in his life according to the Gospels, which are not some made-up stories, because why would the disciples make it up? And also we see that no other human being has come close to even accomplishing what this prophecy has said, except for the man Jesus of Nazareth. So that is one huge reason why I believe, because of fulfilled prophecy like this. Finally, this one is not necessarily integral to the argument, although I'm just going to share one other personal reason why I believe, and it's because of personal miracles in my life. You could also add answered prayers in there. For example, I think one big one is deliverance from demons, right? People say, well, I wish I could see an exorcism on video. Well, you can. I'm going to provide a link in the description of a YouTube channel of my friend Noah Hines. He is a deliverance minister, and he does deliverance ministry, casting out demons. So you can go take a look at some of the videos that he has done with this, and you can see for yourself what goes on there. And whether you choose to believe or not, that's your business. But I've experienced this personally. I've experienced a deliverance personally in my life, getting demons cast out of me, and that's just another personal reason why I believe. So that is everything that I have for my positive case for Christianity. There's so many more things I could talk about. And if you want to know more, check out the resources that are going to be in the link in the description here. I'm going to have a link to books that I've read on this topic, such as I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist from Frank Turk, On Guard from William Lane Craig. I'll also provide websites such as crossexamine.org and the Cross-Examine YouTube channel, which belongs to Frank Turk, and reasonablefaith.org and Dr. Craig videos, which obviously corresponds to Dr. William Lane Craig. So thank you so much for bearing with me here. In the next video, we'll be covering objections to Christianity that were mentioned in this video, and I hope you will stick towards that. Should be very fun, should be also very interesting. So thank you for watching, and have a wonderful rest of your day.